Most favorite thing in the world. Okay, so if we start with just the information that was in the title, we have 6 concepts or 6 ideas, and the first 3 you might think that you know some things about, so I want to try to talk about those first. So you've got the Atlantic slave trade, which is represented as the graphic in the map that shows you how people were kidnapped and brought from West Africa up to Europe, over to the United States, and throughout South and Central America. We're going to talk a little bit about how gender roles apply to the slave trade and how it applies to the slave trade today. And then you're going to think about whether constitutional amendments are helpful in trying to solve this particular problem. What is probably new information is thinking, a lot of students think that the slave trade is over, but the slave trade is not over, and it is different. So it is no longer focused just on West Africans. It is now worldwide, and millions of more people. The 2 most common uses of slaves are sex trafficking, especially for young girls, and then the theft of organs. This obviously links then to healthcare and how people think about healthcare and whether it's going to be a private thing or if it's a public thing, and how people vote, how they get involved in politics. And then finally, what seems to be disconnected is something called the American Disabilities Act, which has not become a constitutional amendment, but it's been a congressional act. So I'm going to try to bring all those things into relationship. No idea how to do this. Okay, I'm just welcoming in Daviti. Okay, so just for Daviti, we're bringing in these 6 concepts into relationship with each other. We're showing how the Atlantic slave trade turned into the global modern version of the slave trade, and how these issues are related to gender and healthcare, and then the American Disabilities Act. So we start with the constitutional legal interpretation of the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, and I think focusing on the right-hand side of the screen is helpful, because the American Disabilities Act does not necessarily stop people from breaking the law, and it doesn't stop discrimination. What it does is it allows for people who have been discriminated against or who have been victims of a broken law to try to bring a lawsuit through a lawyer in court, and these are the quote-unquote decisions that the judge or the lawyer has to try to figure out whether the plaintiff will win or lose. And as you can kind of see in this diagram, it is much easier to lose a case than it is to win a case. In fact, very few people do win their case. The big thing is that this was not something that Congress decided to do because they have good hearts. And this was not the result of a lawsuit. This was because people mobilized together and used something called rights consciousness. They felt that their rights were being violated, and so they worked together to start challenging first the social definitions of what it was to be able-bodied versus what it was to be differently abled or disabled. And they really fought against the exclusions that they were undergoing in their own communities. And again, this was really starting with education itself, where children were being segregated and separated into different groups, depending on what the administrator or what the teacher thought about able-bodiedness. Through that struggle is when lawyers got involved, and you started to see the advocating for particular rights for these groups of people based on the kind of discrimination they were going through, whether it was at the school, whether it was in the workplace, or whether it was in private sector places like the banks and railroad stations and things like that. The first thing that they had to do is challenge the notion that people with disabilities were separate. And that's what kind of created the separate but equal concept for most people, is that, well, they're getting provisions, so how come they should be treated differently? And a large idea was that they should not be treated differently, but they should not be excluded from the same opportunities as everybody else. And this is kind of the background of how the ADA came into effect. And this is over several dozens of years, up to 30 years, just to try to get these basic rights. We then want to bring this into comparison to gender discrimination and the similarities that we kind of see here in the economic sector. And so you see the different versions of discrimination as it comes to income. So white men have dominated most of the positions in, if you think about it, from CEOs, politics, banking, education, for hundreds of years. Over the last 40 years, since the ADA and since the Equal Rights Amendment and access to college, you've seen this be challenged, and so you can kind of see who's been able to get closer to parity or equal pay over that time, and you kind of see who's stuck down at the bottom. If you were then to add disability to this, you'd see those numbers go down. And so this is about one group using the economic system to exclude other people in the group. Gonna let another person in. Okay, so what you have to understand in this system is not to focus on the evil intent of men, and white men in particular, but rather to see that this is what capitalism produces. It produces a system where you trade products using existing trade routes for a profit, which means that you have to charge more than it costs you. So because white men were the benefactors of the system for hundreds of years, they don't want to give up their privileges. They don't want to give up their income. And so they don't want to share with other people in general in the capitalist system because there's no profit in that. You'd lose money if you tried to take that approach. And so you kind of have people competing in a system where there's not a fair product of exchange. So the next aspect then goes to how do we learn about this? Part of the problem with rights in the court system is that it advantages people who go there more often. So people who lawyers that work for companies, lawyers that work for landlords, lawyers that work for banks, they're in court every day. And so they learn the rules of the game, they learn the strategies, they learn the different actors. In some ways it's kind of corrupt. And so they're able to win more often simply because they know the rules better. So it's kind of like the first time you learned how to play chess or a board game with an adult who had been playing it for many years. They're going to beat you most times because they know the rules and you're still learning them. This is largely how it affects people who have been discriminated against. They're not included in the system, so they don't know the system very well. And so the legal system is not usually a place that gives them victory or gives them a win. The other thing is that the Constitution itself defines people as unequal, and that is the goal of the United States Constitution. So the legal system at large, the larger system, is intending to discriminate against people and separate them. So trying to get quote-unquote justice or equality or equity within the legal system most often is not a waste of time, but it's not going to be able to change the entire system through one case. So one issue that people kind of think about a lot is if a law defines that people are supposed to be equal, then what keeps people from actually treating other people equal? Well, the answer is simple. It's history and structures. So if a historical society has not treated people equally for hundreds of years, there's no reason to expect that everybody's going to suddenly treat people equally. It's also the structure, meaning the patterns of your relationships. If you live in a family that it's dominated by a father, then you're going to carry those patterns out into the workplace, into society, into education, and so on. And so based on how you were raised, based on the structures and relationships that you've experienced, you're more likely to enact those situations. And so most people are not sitting around their dinner table talking about the Equal Amendments Act or the American Disabilities Act. And so you've got society that's conflicting here with the goals of society. The main thing that you have to think about is that the system clearly benefits people by treating other people unequally. In fact, that's kind of the modern premise of capitalism, is that you make money by taking money away from other people. That's different treatment. And that system is at least 300 to 400 years old. And so there's history and there's the pattern of relationships that are structured over time to reinforce that system. So this then is easy to understand, I think, sex trafficking and organ theft. There's a lot of money in these two crimes. As you can see here, you can make anywhere from $4,000 to $50,000 per person trafficked. And we're talking about millions of people who are trafficked. You can recruit somebody, kidnap them, bring them into sex trafficking, and then steal their organs and sell them too. So you've got lots of different ways of making money, and that's how you get up to $32 billion a year just in sex trafficking with the link to drug trafficking. And so now, why do all of these things happen in the same system? Because of those trading routes I told you about, right? So you go from one port to another over shipping containers or cargo planes, and they're carrying the same things like TVs, cars, clothing, food, all the things that you and I buy, but they also have little kids. They also have drugs. They also have organs. Now, obviously, this isn't every single plane, not every single train, and not every single ship. And there's a criminal network that's trying not to get caught and, bribing off officials, etc. So this is the same system, though, that occurred during the Atlantic slave trade hundreds of years ago. So again, the Atlantic slave trade never ended. It just added products. So there's more things going through those existing trade routes. So the key understanding here is that the amendments and laws don't change the economic structure. And because the economic structure encourages people to abuse and discriminate against people, especially based on gender, you can't expect much for the equal opportunity laws to actually do anything to change how people's incentives are formed, because as you can see, you can get up to $50,000 per person, which is more than most people make in a single year. Now, you can also say that there's disparities here that are racial and gendered. And so it's far often more young children, they're far more often to be girls, and they're far more often to be people of color. And that is not in proportion to the actual population. So you have a much less chance of being kidnapped and sold into sex trafficking if you're white than if you're if you're Latino, African American, Asian, or multiracial. You can see that there's also a limited pool of sex trafficking going on in the Asian community. That's reported. That's the other issue here, is that not everything is reported. So to review, what we've done is we've thought about this big ideal that we've been told that laws are supposed to change behaviors. But in reality, laws are passed by legislators based on lobbyists and based on people who donate to their campaigns and to their parties. And so those ideals are not exactly clearly defined as how they're going to be implemented. The other problem here is that voters don't generally pay attention to the text of the laws. Laws are often hundreds, if not thousands, of pages long. Some of the legislators say they don't read them. And so voters are usually, for or against things the same way that they're for or against a video on TikTok or YouTube. They're not really paying attention to the details. They generally don't know what they're talking about. And they're mostly arguing against some other side. This is the same thing that most people do all the time, right? We make our decisions based on our culture, our emotional reasoning, and what we think is going to benefit us. And so the ideals of the law are really never the same thing as the ideals of what you think law should be. So your job as a college student is try to analyze all these different levels at the system process. And so you're not just thinking about, am I for or against something? Am I not just thinking about law as an ideal, but how is it actually implemented throughout the system. And so just to remind you, capitalism is going to be the economic driver. That's what people are largely spending their time thinking about: how to make money, how to pay for their things, how to get more things, what jobs to get. Laws then come in second to that. Laws are then ways of regulating and trying to maintain that system. And so when we talk about laws as ideals, that kind of really misses the point of what laws are trying to do, and then things get more complicated because voters and legislators aren't necessarily thinking about the economic system or about laws. And so you can kind of see when we think about sex trafficking, drug trafficking, and the illegal organ trade, you're not going to change much until you change the economic structure and the relationships through history. And so this is largely what protests are about.